Imagine a secret so valuable, it could single-handedly alter the balance of global power. For a full decade, the United States possessed exactly that. Deep beneath the frigid, turbulent waters of a hostile sea, an almost invisible listening device was eavesdropping on the most sensitive communications of a rival superpower. It was a masterpiece of covert engineering, an intelligence goldmine delivering pristine, unencrypted secrets about everything from military readiness to plans for a preemptive strategic attack. The adversary was so supremely confident in their security, they never imagined such a thing was even possible. Then, one day in the year 1980, the line went dead. The silence was absolute. This was no accident, no technical glitch. The most daring intelligence operation of its time had been exposed. The hunt began, not for a foreign operative, but for a shadow within their own ranks, someone who had seen the unseen and sold the unspeakable for a price. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. The story begins in the depths. In October of 1971, the American nuclear-powered submarine USS Halibut moved silently into the icy sea of Okhotsk, deep within Soviet-controlled waters. Navy divers emerged from the vessel, descending 400 feet into the crushing blackness. Their target was a seemingly ordinary undersea communications cable, a vital link between two major Soviet naval bases. The divers carefully attached a massive 20-foot-long recording device, a marvel of technology designed to intercept the signals passing through the wire without ever breaking the connection. Their mission a success, they vanished back into the shadowy depths. For the next 10 years, American intelligence listened in, gaining an unprecedented window into the heart of the Soviet military machine. They learned about submarine and missile technology, military preparedness, and strategic capabilities. The operation, codenamed Ivy Bells, was considered one of the most successful intelligence programs of the era. But then came the silence. In 1980, the messages suddenly stopped. Ivy Bells was over. The idea that the Soviets had discovered the sophisticated wiretap by chance was almost zero. It had to be an inside job. The breach of trust sent shockwaves through the intelligence community, but the identity of the person responsible remained a mystery for years. Only later would they discover the man who traded this crown jewel of intelligence for a handful of cash. The National Security Agency, or NSA, prides itself on being the nation's chief collector and protector of signals intelligence. But as it learned the hard way, no fortress is immune to betrayal from within. And the source of this particular betrayal was a man named Ronald W. Pelton. Born in 1941, Pelton's journey began like that of so many other outwardly patriotic Americans of his generation. He was a good student, graduating in the top quarter of his high school class before joining the United States Air Force. There, he spent 4 years as an intelligence analyst, showing a remarkable aptitude for languages. He even took a Russian language course, a skill highly valued during the ongoing geopolitical tensions. After being discharged in 1964, he returned to his hometown in Michigan, living a quiet, middle-class life as a TV repairman. He married a woman named Judith, and they started a family. But Pelton's talents for language and analysis were too valuable to be spent fixing electronics. In 1965, the world of intelligence called him back. He was recruited by the NSA for a civilian role, specializing in operations targeting the Soviet Union. He showed early promise and was clearly a clever analyst, but there were warning signs. His colleagues found him immature and arrogant, with an ego that often spiraled out of control. His personal conduct soon became a problem. While assigned to work in the United Kingdom, Pelton was formally reprimanded by his superiors after he was caught breaking into a casino slot machine, making off with the equivalent of just $13.50. It also came to light that he was having an affair with the wife of an NSA colleague, a scandal that resulted in the other couple being sent back to the United States. Despite these red flags and his 14 years of service, Ronald Pelton never managed to climb very high within the agency's ranks. He earned a respectable middle-class income of $24,500 a year. But with a wife and 4 children to support, the money was tight. Pelton was a schemer and a borderline spendthrift, and as the 1970s drew to a close, the seams of his personal life began to tear apart. By the end of the decade, Ronald Pelton was facing a crisis. He was in dire financial straits, having racked up huge debts on a home-building project that went disastrously over budget. Drowning in debt, he was forced to file for bankruptcy in 1979. He lived in constant fear that his financial status would jeopardize his high-level security clearance, and by extension, his job at the NSA. Doubting he could pass his next routine polygraph examination, Pelton chose to resign from the agency rather than face a humiliating dismissal. After leaving in July of 1979, he took a job as a salesman for a boat builder in Annapolis, a far cry from his former career in high-stakes intelligence. But his dreams of getting rich selling yachts never materialized. He barely managed to make a living. With just a few $100s in his bank account and facing a mountain of debt, Ronald Pelton began to scheme. He may have been out of the intelligence game, but he knew the secrets he still carried in his head were incredibly valuable. Pelton was said to have a photographic memory, and he could recall in vivid detail the sensitive operations he'd been privy to at the NSA. He knew about joint covert projects. He knew what the US knew and what it didn't know about Russian ciphers and encrypted communications. Desperate for cash, he made a fateful decision. On the 14th of January 1980, he picked up the phone and called the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He stammered his way through the conversation, telling the person on the other end that he had worked for the American government and had information to sell. Intrigued, they invited him to a meeting at the embassy the very next night. As it happened, the FBI was listening. A wiretap on the embassy's phone lines had picked up the entire call. They didn't recognize the caller's voice, but they kept constant surveillance on the embassy and hoped to get a visual on the would-be traitor when he showed up. But they were taken completely by surprise. At 2:32 p.m. the next day, the mystery caller phoned the embassy again, announcing he would be there in the next 2 minutes. The FBI agents on duty scrambled to get eyes on the entrance, but it was too late. All they saw was the man's back as he slipped behind the embassy gates. They had missed their chance to get a positive ID. Once inside, Pelton met with Vitaly Yurchenko, the KGB officer in charge of embassy security. From that moment, the fates of these 2 men would be forever intertwined. Yurchenko introduced himself using an alias and began to ask some preliminary questions. He quickly determined that this squat, red-headed American was the real deal. The self-proclaimed former NSA employee was worth talking to. Yurchenko went upstairs to call his boss, the KGB station chief, and told him there was a man downstairs ready to trade NSA secrets for cash. Pelton didn't mince words. He made it clear he was there for the money, and his transparency convinced the KGB that he was a genuine volunteer, not a CIA plant sent to deceive them. After a long debriefing, the KGB had a new problem: how to get Pelton out of the building without being seen. They were fully aware of the constant FBI surveillance, so simply walking out the front door was not an option. At the time, the embassy was undergoing a major renovation. To avoid the risk of American intelligence planting a spy among the workers, the Soviets had flown in all their own carpenters, plumbers, and fitters from Russia. It was decided that Pelton would stay the night at the embassy. The next morning, on the 15th of January, freshly shaven and disguised in painter's overalls, Ronald Pelton slipped out the rear exit with a group of construction workers. He was driven to another Soviet-owned property, and from there, dropped off outside a busy shopping mall. Just like that, he had given the FBI the slip and become an active Soviet agent. For the next 5 years, Pelton revealed everything he could remember about NSA techniques, targets, and operations. He would meet his KGB handler at various public places around Washington, from restaurants to shopping malls. The KGB placed a high value on the intelligence he provided, even flying him to Vienna, the so-called espionage capital of the world, on at least 2 occasions. There, for hours on end, he unloaded a treasure trove of the NSA's most guarded secrets. He compromised Project Vortex, a type of spy satellite designed to intercept radio transmissions from high Earth orbit. But the most valuable piece of information he gave away was the existence of Operation Ivy Bells. The hugely successful operation to tap the undersea cable had provided America with profound insight into Soviet military planning. But thanks to Ronald Pelton, the good times were over. In 1981, American satellites spotted Soviet ships, including a salvage vessel, anchored directly over the tap site. The game was up. When an American ship was dispatched a few months later to recover the recording device, it was gone, scooped up by the Soviets. The compromise not only stopped the flow of valuable intelligence, but also scuttled future plans. The NSA had intended to replace the recorders with a new, always-online system that wouldn't require divers to physically retrieve the tapes, a change that would have made the operation even more powerful. All of that was now lost. For his 5 years of service to the KGB, Pelton received payments totaling just $35,000. It was a paltry sum, not nearly enough to cover his debts, let alone fund a comfortable retirement. As he continued his clandestine meetings, his personal life crumbled further. He separated from his wife, Judith, and became estranged from his children. For 5 years, the FBI had no idea who their mystery traitor was. The trail that began with that muffled phone call had gone completely cold. Then, in August of 1985, something incredible happened. A high-ranking KGB officer named Vitaly Yurchenko walked into the American embassy in Rome and announced he wanted to defect. He was the very same man who had first met Ronald Pelton inside the Soviet embassy 5 years earlier. Yurchenko began to reveal a wealth of information, and among the secrets he shared was the story of a disgruntled, red-headed NSA analyst who had walked in off the street in 1980. The FBI finally had their lead. They connected Yurchenko's story to the mysterious phone call and quickly zeroed in on Pelton. The net was closing, but the story had one more shocking twist. Just 3 months after his defection, Vitaly Yurchenko gave his CIA handlers the slip during a dinner in Washington, D.C. He walked a few blocks to the Soviet embassy, held a press conference, and announced that he had been abducted and drugged by the Americans. He then redefected, returning to the Soviet Union, where he was welcomed as a hero. To this day, the Yurchenko affair remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of intelligence history. Was he a genuine defector who simply got cold feet? Or was he a brilliant double agent, sent by the KGB to sow disinformation and confusion, perhaps even sacrificing a low-level asset like Pelton to protect someone more important? Ronald Pelton was eventually apprehended and his treachery exposed. He was a man driven not by ideology, but by ego, pride, and an inability to manage his own life. For $35,000, he dismantled one of the most successful intelligence operations in American history, a breach that cost his country immeasurably more. His story serves as a stark reminder that the greatest threats can often come from the most ordinary places, born from simple human failings. But the lingering question remains, what was Vitaly Yurchenko's real game? The world may never know the full truth behind the man who exposed the spy. Imagine a spy is finally unmasked, not by years of meticulous investigation, but by a ghost. A witness who provides the single crucial clue to identify the traitor, and then, in a twist that would be rejected by any Hollywood screenwriter for being too unbelievable, vanishes back behind the Iron Curtain, leaving the case against the spy in absolute tatters. This isn't fiction. This is the baffling story of how the FBI found themselves in a race against time, armed with a phantom testimony and facing a man whose own ego would become their most powerful and most unpredictable weapon. They had the name of their suspect, Ronald Pelton, but their star witness was now an enemy of the state once more, publicly recanting his story. With almost no hard evidence, they were forced to make a desperate gamble, a psychological play so risky that if it failed, a man who had sold some of America's most sensitive secrets would walk away a free man forever. With his professional life in ashes, Ronald Pelton's personal world was also spiraling. In the 1984th year, he began a relationship with Ann Barry, a striking former beauty contestant he met in a bar. Their connection was fueled by a shared love for hard partying, a lifestyle that kept Pelton adrift. Some nights he'd stay at her apartment, other nights he'd sleep on a friend's boat or simply couch surf. He was a man without an anchor, oblivious to the fact that halfway across the world, a chain of events was unfolding that would seal his fate. The very same Soviet security officer Pelton had first met at the embassy was steadily ascending the ranks of the KGB. By this time, Vitaly Yurchenko had become a colonel, holding the powerful position of deputy chief of the First Department within the First Chief Directorate, the Soviet equivalent of the CIA. His department was responsible for all espionage operations in the United States and Canada. In the world of intelligence, he was a giant, rated by the CIA as the KGB's number 5 man. But that wasn't the whole story. So you can imagine the shock that rippled through the American intelligence community when, in August of the 1985th year, Colonel Yurchenko calmly walked into the American embassy in Rome and announced he wanted to defect. American agents could hardly believe their luck. It was difficult to fathom why a man so deeply embedded in the KGB's leadership would switch sides. Theories swirled. Perhaps he was genuinely frustrated with the Soviet system, or maybe he was trying to escape a difficult family life. Another compelling factor was a former mistress who had since relocated to Canada. Yurchenko harbored hopes of rekindling their affair. He was immediately flown to the United States, where he was set up in a fully furnished home, given $1 million in cash, and a yearly salary of over $60,000. In a secure house in Northern Virginia, Yurchenko underwent a grueling debriefing by a joint CIA and FBI team, a process that would stretch on for 3 long months. And the secrets he shared were breathtaking. Among the revelations was the existence of 2 moles deep within American intelligence. One was a former CIA officer, known to Yurchenko only by his code name, Robert. This man was quickly identified as Edward Lee Howard, who, upon realizing he was under investigation, fled to the Soviet Union. But it was the second traitor that truly concerned the agents. Yurchenko described an NSA analyst who had walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington 5 years prior, offering his services. He couldn't recall the man's name, remembering only that he might have used the name Mr. Long. However, Yurchenko remembered other, more vivid details. The man was middle-aged, had red hair, and had been incredibly enthusiastic about selling his country's secrets. On the 20th of October, 1985, Yurchenko was shown a series of color photographs of red-haired men who were current or former NSA employees. Without hesitation, he pointed directly at the photo of Ronald Pelton. In that single moment, the game was up. Until Yurchenko's debriefing, Pelton had never been under even a whisper of suspicion. It seemed fate itself had intervened to bring about his downfall. With a positive identification, the FBI launched Operation Pasty, a massive investigation involving up to 200 agents. They unearthed the original recording of Pelton's first phone call to the Soviet embassy and played it for dozens of his former NSA colleagues. At least one of them positively identified the voice as Pelton's. Agents traced him to an apartment in Silver Spring, Maryland, but after days of watching, he never appeared. The trail eventually led them to his girlfriend Ann Barry's apartment, where they confirmed Pelton was a regular guest. From that moment on, he was placed under constant 24-hour surveillance. His phone was tapped, and listening devices were hidden in his car and inside his girlfriend's home. But as the FBI listened and waited, they found nothing. The surveillance revealed no espionage, only that Pelton and his girlfriend were regular drug users and that he was involved in a minor scheme to defraud a bank. This wasn't what they were after. The investigation was proving fruitless, and pressure was mounting to make a move on a man they couldn't yet prove was a spy. And that's when their perfect case began to unravel in the most spectacular way possible. Their star witness, Vitaly Yurchenko, was growing restless. The FBI had ill-advisedly allowed him a trip to Canada to find his old flame, but his hopes were shattered. She was now a married pediatrician with 2 children and flatly rejected his proposal to run away with him. A dejected Yurchenko then returned to the US, only to be horrified to learn that details of his defection and debriefing had been leaked to the press by someone within the CIA. He feared for the safety of his family back in Russia. Yurchenko was a complicated man, a hypochondriac who lived in constant fear of stomach cancer, and he wasn't without his own professional baggage. He had botched operations and had numerous affairs, including one with the wife of a colleague who was suspected of being an FBI informant. Then, the story took its most dramatic twist. On the 2nd of November, 1985, Yurchenko was having dinner with his CIA handler in Washington, D.C., just a stone's throw from the Soviet embassy. At one point, he stood up and said to the agent, "If I'm not back in 15 minutes, don't blame yourself." With those chilling words, he walked out of the restaurant, up Wisconsin Avenue, and slipped back inside the gates of the Soviet compound. Just 3 months after arriving in the West, Yurchenko was going home. In the blink of an eye, the CIA's greatest intelligence victory of the Cold War had become its most humiliating nightmare. A few days later, Yurchenko appeared at a press conference, claiming he had been drugged and kidnapped by American agents. U.S. authorities had no grounds to hold him and could only watch in embarrassment as the Russian colonel boarded a flight back to Moscow on the 6th of November. Yurchenko's redefection was a massive propaganda win for the Soviets, but for the FBI, it was a catastrophe. Their investigation into Ronald Pelton was now in jeopardy. Without their star witness, the case was built on circumstantial evidence. The FBI decided it was time for a direct approach, a high-stakes gamble that hinged entirely on one thing: Pelton's ego. They believed that if they could get him into a room, the smartest man in the room would eventually talk himself into a corner. The stage was set in room 409 of the Annapolis Hilton Hotel. FBI agents David Faulkner and Dudley Hodgson rehearsed their roles for days. On the morning of the 24th of November, 1985, Faulkner called Pelton at his job, requesting a meeting about a matter of national security. Letting his ego and curiosity get the better of him, Pelton agreed. At the hotel, the agents began their performance, regaling Pelton with a tale of a suspected mole, weaving in details that perfectly mirrored his own life and actions. They spoke of how this man had compromised a top-secret operation and betrayed countless other secrets. Then, they played the tape, the recording of the phone call to the Soviet embassy from 5 years earlier. Pelton initially denied it was him, but hearing his own voice bounce off the hotel room walls made him crack. He shifted his strategy, offering to cooperate and become a double agent for the FBI. The agents had no intention of accepting, but they let him talk, listening as he rambled on about his trips to Vienna and the money he'd received. As lunchtime approached, Pelton said he needed to meet his girlfriend. Reluctantly, knowing they still didn't have a solid confession, the agents let him leave, but not before making him surrender his passport. They watched as Pelton and Anne had lunch and returned to her apartment. The FBI then called him, urging him to come back to the Hilton to answer more questions. Thinking his double agent offer was still on the table, Pelton agreed. Once back in the hot seat, it wasn't long before he made the critical mistake. He finally admitted to knowingly handing over secret information to a foreign power, acknowledging that his actions had harmed American national security and put lives at risk. That was it. That was the confession they needed. Ronald Pelton was promptly arrested. The FBI's gamble had paid off. Convinced he was clever enough to outwit them, Pelton's own arrogance had led to his downfall. Had he simply remained silent, with Yurchenko back behind the Iron Curtain, he might very well have avoided arrest altogether. The American public was already reeling from a string of spy scandals that year, a period that would become known as the Year of the Spy. But the revelation of a traitor inside the NSA, the agency so secretive it was jokingly called No Such Agency, was a profound shock. Despite his confession, Pelton pleaded not guilty. On the 5th of June, 1986, a jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences. The judge remarked that his treachery had caused inestimable damage, all for a paltry $35,000, a sum that wasn't even enough to clear his debts. But the story didn't end there. During a later debriefing, the FBI sensed Pelton was still holding back. So, in the 1987th year, they ran one last play. They sent a woman, posing as a lawyer, to speak with him. Believing he was protected by attorney-client privilege, Pelton opened the floodgates, revealing a torrent of other secrets he had sold. The information was so sensitive that authorities decided not to file further charges, fearing the details would be exposed in open court. After a failed appeal, Pelton served 30 years. He was paroled just before Thanksgiving in 2015, a 74-year-old man, penniless and forgotten by the world he had betrayed. He lived quietly with his daughter until his passing on the 6th of September, 2022. In the decades since, a tantalizing and disturbing theory has emerged about this bizarre case. Some intelligence analysts and historians now speculate that Vitaly Yurchenko was never a genuine defector at all. The theory suggests he was a brilliant plant, sent by the KGB on a mission of disinformation. His objective may have been to expose a less valuable, already compromised asset like Ronald Pelton, in order to protect a far more important mole still operating deep within American intelligence, someone like Aldrich Ames or Robert Hansen. In this version of events, Yurchenko's dramatic redefection wasn't a failure, but the successful completion of his mission. It makes you wonder, was Ronald Pelton, the man undone by his own ego, simply a pawn in a much larger, more sophisticated game? Was his capture not the result of a lucky break for the FBI, but a calculated sacrifice in the shadowy chess match of the Cold War? It's a question that adds a final, unsettling layer of mystery to the story of the man from no such agency.